Hello, today we are talking about biofuels. So, biofuels are a renewable energy source that are derived from either plant or algae material, or it can be derived from an animal waste. More specifically, in this project, I'm going to be focusing on alcohols, specifically ethanol, but there's also biobutanol, which are all made through fermentation. Many people have likely heard the word ethanol, likely because it's in a lot of our day-to-day usage. So, for example, our cars. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, more than 90% of U.S. gasoline contains ethanol. And it's also known as other things such as ethyl alcohol, grain alcohol, and ETOH. Many vehicle owners utilize it in some way. At the gas pump, when you're pumping the gas into your car, the gas is actually a blend of gasoline and ethanol to prevent engine issues and also allow driving capabilities. And majority of vehicles use 87 octane gas at the pump, which is a blend of 10% ethanol and gasoline. So what exactly is ethanol and how is it produced? As I mentioned earlier, ethanol is a type of biofuel, which means that the energy is either from a plant or algae material, or it can be from an animal product. I had also mentioned that it came from fermentation. In the US, ethanol is made from starch and corn. However, in other countries such as Brazil, they can use sugarcane. After the fermentation of corn or the sugar-based crops, it's followed by distillation to make a high alcohol content liquid. Ethanol is also a major component of wine, so you can think of it like that. If many people understand that wine is a product of grapes, and this is made through a process of the grapes are crushed, then yeast ferments the sugars within the grapes to produce ethanol. So there are several advantages to having ethanol as our energy source. Energy Tracker actually points out several of these advantages. Firstly, they point out that it's a renewable resource, which is very beneficial for us because that means that our supply is replenishable. Since we consume a lot of energy, that means that we need a large source of energy. And so, since it's renewable and it gets replenished, it's kind of on this continuous cycle. We have this continuous source of energy. And so, whereas non-renewable resources, once that material runs out, we won't have any more energy that we can create from that resource. So that's why it's so important for us. I'm sure many of us have heard about the greenhouse gases and emissions and all of that through our years of education. And so, compared to other sources of energy like fossil fuels, ethanol doesn't release as much carbon when it's burned. Energy Tracker also mentions energy independence. And so that means basically that the United States has our own energy source rather than relying on other countries for energy. And so we saw a few years ago, back when the Ukraine-Russia war was very intense, I think it was in 2022, when the United States was basically telling Russia that we weren't going to buy any more of their oil and gas from them. And so that sparked a lot of panic in the United States because we were worried about our energy supply. And so that shows how important it is for us to have our own source of energy, because in case of other conflicts, we need to be able to rely on ourselves to be able to provide our own energy and not have to rely on another energy or another country to supply our energy. As with anything, there are advantages and disadvantages to something, and so some of the disadvantages, also pointed out again by Energy Tracker, is that there's land limitations, which means because it's crop based, either sugar or corn, you still need a large amount of land to plant all of these crops with the correct conditions, such as the soil, the weather, all of those conditions that are necessary for the success of either the sugar or corn crop. And also, we need to consider that not every single thing we plant is for our energy source. We also need stuff to eat and survive. And as I had mentioned earlier, we use a lot of energy, so that would mean that we need a lot of crops and land. And we also need enough room to build houses, hospitals, all of those kind of buildings that we have today. We need room to still have. Another thing to consider is the water supply limitations. So we all know that plants require sunlight, nutrients in soil, carbon dioxide, and water in order to successfully grow. And so growing a large amount of these crops would require a lot of water, which could conflict with our own supply. And recently, especially in the southern areas of Texas, would know that there's a lot of droughts in the areas. And so this means that our water supply is even more limited because it's not raining as much, which means we're not getting a whole bunch of water. And so we also need water to supply. And so here's the conflict of the competition of us versus the crops for water. Our last disadvantage that we will be talking about is climate control. Although ethanol is not as harmful to the environment as other sources such as the fossil fuel, it does bring negative impacts to our environment still. And so the release of greenhouse gases when burned does impact climate change, as with any other resource that we burn. It will release some sort of carbon into the environment, which will impact climate change. If you've ever noticed on the gas pumps whenever you're filling your car, the actual dollar amount goes to 3 decimal places. And so trading economics tells us that the price of ethanol is $1.740 US dollars per gallon. And compared to other fuel resources, this is actually relatively cheap. Okay, so upon double checking the rubric before submitting the assignment, it turns out that I do not need this information, but I figured I'd still briefly touch on it and include it. What I'm talking about here is just alternative sources and the shift from gas vehicles to electric vehicles, and how electric vehicles are better for the environment and agriculture, which are both pretty big negatives to ethanol. And also, because ethanol is in gas, it would reduce the amount of gas if we were to take away all of the gasoline cars, as well as other sources that uses them, such as lawnmowers and leaf blowers and that stuff. And here are my sources. The first source, which is Energy Tracker, was used for the advantages and disadvantages that I had mentioned. The second source, which is Britannica, was used for the biofuels definition that I gave in the very beginning of the presentation. Trading Economics is a source that has a bunch of charts of current prices of materials and fuel sources and other things like that. And a large source of information that I used for the project is the U.S. Department of Energy, and I also took my own pictures and used those throughout the presentation, so I did not cite those. And thank you for watching/listening.